The moment I realized my own children had stopped seeing me as a person. I was standing in my daughter's kitchen doorway, holding a casserole dish I had spent 2 days preparing, and not a single person in that crowded room looked up. It was Christmas Eve in Oakville, Ontario. Snow had been falling since morning. The soft, quiet kind that makes everything look like a greeting card. I had driven 40 minutes through it alone, the back seat of my Buick packed with food I hadn't been asked to bring, gifts I had wrapped carefully, and a hope I hadn't yet admitted was foolish. When I slipped out the front door 3 hours later, nobody noticed. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that I wasn't just leaving Christmas dinner. I was leaving behind the last version of myself that would ever ask to be loved by people who only remembered I existed when they needed something from me. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who are supposed to be your family, I think you'll understand this story. And before I begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Sometimes just knowing someone else is out there, listening, makes all the difference. My husband Walter passed away 4 years before that Christmas. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the morning. I held his hand while the monitor went still. We had been married 41 years, long enough that I had stopped knowing where he ended and I began. Walter was a quiet man, a civil engineer, who spent his weekends fixing things for neighbors who never asked, and who cried at nature documentaries when he thought I wasn't watching. After he died, the house in Oakville felt like a museum of a life that no longer had a curator. Our daughter Sylvia lived 20 minutes away with her husband Conrad, and their teenage son Bryce. Our son Paul lived in Hamilton with his girlfriend Terry, whom I had met perhaps 4 times in 3 years. In the months after Walter's funeral, both children were present, attentive, kind. Sylvia brought groceries. Paul called every Sunday. For a while, grief felt like something we were carrying together. Then the groceries stopped. Then the Sunday calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. Then something that happened around major holidays and birthdays, if the timing was convenient. I told myself it was normal. People have their own lives. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who made her children feel guilty for living. But there is a difference between giving people space and slowly disappearing from their awareness entirely. And I didn't understand that difference until Christmas Eve, when I stood in my daughter's kitchen and felt it with my whole body. That morning had begun the way it always did. I woke before 6, made coffee, stood at the back window, watching the snow collect on the fence posts. I had a habit of talking to Walter in those early morning minutes. Not out loud, just in my thoughts. I'd tell him what was worrying me, what I was hoping for, what I had dreamed about the night before. He never answered, of course. But the habit kept something alive in me that I wasn't ready to let go of. I spent the morning cooking tourtière, because Walter's mother had taught me the recipe 40 years ago, and it had been on our table every Christmas since. Butter tarts, a cranberry loaf, roasted root vegetables with thyme. Enough food for 10 people, though Sylvia hadn't asked me to bring anything. She never asked anymore. I brought food anyway because that was the only language I still knew how to speak in my own family. Effort, presence, showing up. Around noon, Sylvia sent a text, not a call, a text. Roads are getting bad, drive safe, see you at 4. That was the entire message, no asking how I was. No, can't wait to see you. Just a logistical note. I stared at it for longer than I should have before putting my phone face down on the counter. I loaded everything into the car carefully, tucking the tourtière in an insulated bag, nestling the butter tarts in a tin with a ribbon on top. As I was arranging things in the back seat, I noticed something that stopped me cold. I couldn't remember the last time Sylvia had asked how I was sleeping. Not once, in months, had either of my children asked whether I was lonely. They asked about the car, whether the furnace had been serviced, whether I'd talked to the accountant about Walter's estate. Practical questions. Administrative questions. The questions you ask about a property you're responsible for maintaining, not a person you love. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. Then I pulled out of the driveway and drove toward my daughter's house, because that's what mothers do. We show up, even when everything in us knows on some quiet level that showing up may not be enough anymore. Sylvia's house was already full when I arrived. Cars lined both sides of the street. Through the front window, I could see the warm glow of the tree lights, silhouettes moving past the glass, the visual shorthand of a family celebration well underway. Hope is a stubborn thing. Even standing on that snowy driveway, carrying a casserole dish with oven mitts, I thought, maybe tonight would be different. Maybe we'd sit together after dinner and talk about Walter. Maybe Sylvia would put her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was a girl. I rang the doorbell. No one came. I rang it again. A full minute passed. Then the door opened and it was Bryce, 16 years old, earbuds around his neck, clearly on his way back to wherever he'd been. "Oh, hey, Grandma." He held the door for me, glanced at what I was carrying. "Want me to take something?" Before I could answer, he was already walking back toward the stairs. I stepped inside alone and stood in the hallway for a moment. The house smelled of pine and something store-bought baking in the oven. The living room was full. Conrad's brother and his wife, a couple I half recognized from Sylvia's book club, two small children I didn't know at all running in circles around the coffee table. Sylvia appeared from the kitchen. She kissed my cheek quickly, the way you kiss an aunt you see twice a year. "Mom, hi. Glad you made it. Road's okay?" "Fine, yes. I brought." "Oh, just put it anywhere in the kitchen. There's space on the counter by the window." She was already turning back toward her guests. "Conrad's opening wine, do you want some?" I carried my things into the kitchen myself. The counter by the window was crowded with store-bought platters, still in their grocery packaging. I set the tourtière down beside a plastic tray of cocktail shrimp. No one came to ask what it was. No one lifted the lid. No one said anything at all. I found a spot near the kitchen doorway and stood there with my glass of wine and tried to look as though I was exactly where I wanted to be. Paul arrived an hour later with Terry. He hugged me, a quick, one-armed thing, and said, "Hey, Mom. You look good." Which is what people say when they haven't looked at you in long enough that they've forgotten what you actually look like. Terry smiled and said it was nice to see me, and then they both moved toward the living room where Conrad was holding court about something to do with interest rates. I drifted. That's the only word for it. I moved from room to room looking for somewhere I fit. I tried to join a conversation near the tree. It closed politely around me and resumed. I sat down beside one of Conrad's relatives, and she smiled and asked if I lived nearby, and when I said I was Sylvia's mother, she said, "Oh, how lovely," and turned back to her husband. Then dinner was called, and everyone moved toward the dining room. And I followed, and that was when I saw it. Sylvia had borrowed a long folding table and set it up adjacent to the dining room, through the doorway into the den, to accommodate the extra guests. The main dining table had 8 chairs, each with a folded napkin and a small name card. I looked for mine. It wasn't there. Sylvia appeared at my elbow. "Mom, we put you at the extended table just through there. It's actually cozier. You'll have more room." More room. The extended table had 4 seats. The other 3 were occupied by Conrad's elderly uncle, who was hard of hearing, a family friend who'd arrived late and hadn't been introduced to me, and a 12-year-old I didn't know. I sat down with my plate of food and looked through the doorway at the main table, where Sylvia, Paul, and Conrad and Terry were laughing about something I couldn't hear. And I understood, in my body more than my mind, that I had become someone who was accommodated rather than included. I ate quietly. I smiled at Conrad's uncle when he made a comment about the weather. I passed the bread basket to the 12-year-old. I did not cry, though something in my chest was pressing very hard against my ribs. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to find the washroom. The hallway near Conrad's home office was quiet, and as I passed the door, which was half open, the light on inside, I heard voices. I recognized Paul's voice first. "The Oakville place is the real asset. Everything else is secondary." I stopped. Conrad answered, "I know, but we have to be careful about timing." Paul again, lower now, "Careful. She's not going to bring it up herself, she never does." A pause. Then Conrad, "Which is why we need to have that conversation sooner rather than later." My pulse was loud in my ears. I stood very still in the hallway. "If we position it right," Paul said, "it doesn't have to be a confrontation. We just need to help her understand that the house is too much for one person. Too much for one person. Our house, Walter's and mine. The house we had bought when Sylvia was 2 years old and Paul wasn't yet born. The house where I had planted 40 years of gardens. where Walter had built the back deck with his own hands, where every doorframe still held the stencil marks of children growing. My house. I pressed my back against the hallway wall. My wine glass was still in my hand. I was aware in a distant way that I should move, should walk away, should pretend I hadn't heard. But my feet would not cooperate. Then Sylvia's voice joined them. I hadn't realized she was in there too. I just don't want it to turn into a fight, she said. You know how she gets. How I get. It won't, Conrad said. Not if we approach it correctly. There are options, a smaller place, a retirement community, whatever she wants. But the house needs to be part of the conversation. And the sooner the better, Paul said. The market in Oakville right now. I stopped listening. Not because there was nothing more to hear, because there was nothing more I needed to hear. The market. The asset. Too much for one person. I walked back to the extended table in the den and sat down. The 12-year-old was explaining something about a video game to Conrad's uncle, who was nodding pleasantly without having heard a word. I picked up my fork and finished what was on my plate. For the remainder of the meal, I watched my family through the doorway. I watched Sylvia refill glasses. I watched Paul make everyone laugh. I watched Conrad carve the ham with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in the role of host, the role of head of household, the role of person in charge. And I understood something that I had been refusing to understand for a long time. I was no longer someone they loved. I was something they managed. When dessert was served, Sylvia brought me a slice of store-bought Yule log, and I noticed she walked past my tourtière without acknowledging it, without asking who had made it, without knowing or caring that the recipe had come from Walter's mother, who had come from Abitibi, who had learned it from her own mother in a farmhouse kitchen 100 years ago. 3 generations of love in a pastry shell, sitting untouched on a counter beside plastic shrimp. I set down my fork. I thought about the pencil marks on the doorframe. Then I quietly stood up, took my coat from the front closet, picked up my purse, and walked to the front door. I paused there for just a moment, some stubborn, diminishing part of me still hoping that someone would call my name, that Sylvia would look up from her conversation, that Paul would notice the empty chair. No one did. I opened the door and stepped out into the snow. It had gotten colder. The street was quiet, the neighbors' windows glowing amber and gold. I walked to my car and stood with my hand on the door handle and looked back at the house. From outside it looked exactly like Christmas, warm and full and whole. No one driving past would have guessed that the woman in the driveway had just become invisible to the people she had given her entire adult life to. I got in the car, started the engine, sat there for a moment with my hands in my lap. My phone lit up on the passenger seat, a message from Sylvia. Mom, did you leave? Where are you? Then one from Paul, Mom, call us. Then Sylvia again, please answer. I looked at the messages for a long time. Then I put the car in drive. I had not planned to go to Gwendolyn Marsh's house. I hadn't spoken to Gwen in perhaps 6 weeks. The way old friendships sometimes fall into gaps during the difficult seasons of life. But Gwen had been Walter's closest colleague for 20 years. A property lawyer who had known us both since we were young parents, trying to figure out how to afford a mortgage. She had sat in the front row at his funeral. She had sent me a card on the first anniversary of his death, handwritten 3 pages long. She was, I realized as I drove through the empty Christmas Eve streets of Oakville, the person Walter would have told me to call. Her lights were on. I sat in her driveway for 2 minutes before I rang the bell. The door opened almost immediately and there was Gwen. Reading glasses pushed up on her head, a mug of tea in hand, the particular expression of someone who takes one look at your face and understands everything without needing to be told. Eleanor. She stepped back and opened the door wide. Come in right now. That was all it took. 2 words and a held door, and I started to cry. Gwen set me down at her kitchen table with tea and shortbread and the kind of silence that doesn't require filling. She waited until I had said everything. The folding table, the doorway conversation, the market in Oakville, the tourtière no one touched. She listened without interrupting, without offering explanations on my children's behalf, without reaching for the comforting lie that I was probably misreading things. When I finished, she set down her mug. Eleanor, she said, there's something I need to tell you. The kitchen felt very still. She stood and walked to the small desk in the corner of her living room, opened the bottom drawer, and returned with an envelope. It was sealed with tape that had gone slightly yellow at the edges. Across the front in Walter's handwriting were 6 words, "For Eleanor." To be opened if needed. I could not speak. Gwen sat down across from me. He gave this to me 7 months before he died. He said I would know when the time was right. She paused. I've been carrying it for 4 years. My hands were shaking as I took it from her. He saw things, Eleanor. In the last year of his life, he talked to me about the children. Not accusingly. You know, Walter, he never spoke badly of anyone. But he was worried. He asked me questions about estate planning, about asset protection, about what options existed for a widow living alone. Her voice was careful, steady. He asked me what someone would need to do if they wanted to make sure no one could pressure their spouse into decisions that weren't in their best interest. I stared at the envelope. I put him in touch with someone, Gwen said quietly. A colleague of mine. And then he did what Walter always did, which was prepare. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, folded in thirds, written on the pale blue notepaper Walter always kept in his desk drawer. His handwriting was the same as I remembered. Angular and careful. The handwriting of an engineer. My darling Eleanor, if you're reading this, then something has happened that I hoped wouldn't. I want you to know first that none of it is your fault. You have always believed the best of the people you love. That is not a flaw. But it can make you vulnerable to people who confuse your kindness for permission. I noticed things in the last few years that I didn't tell you about because I didn't want to worry you and because I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was wrong. Questions about the house that came too often. Conversations that stopped when you entered the room. An interest in our finances that seemed to go beyond concern. I hope it was nothing. But if it wasn't, I want you protected. Gwen knows everything. Trust her completely. And trust yourself, Eleanor. You are more capable and more clear-eyed than you've allowed yourself to believe since I died. All my love, always. Walter folded the letter carefully and held it for a long time without speaking. What did he do? I finally asked. The preparations. Gwen folded her hands on the table. He restructured things. The house is held in a trust, Eleanor. A trust structured specifically to prevent any transfer of ownership without your direct, witnessed authorization and independent legal review. No one can pressure you into selling, signing, or transferring without a process that would expose exactly what was happening. She paused. He also left separate investment accounts in your name alone, not connected to the estate in any way that Paul or Sylvia could access or monitor. I thought about the conversation I had overheard. The market in Oakville. The timing. The asset. They can't do anything without you, Gwen said gently. That was the whole point. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout all of this. I turned it over now and looked at the screen. 11 messages. 4 from Sylvia, 3 from Paul, 2 from Conrad. And this surprised me. 2 from Bryce. My grandson. I opened Bryce's first. Grandma, Mom is freaking out. Are you okay? Where did you go? Then the second 15 minutes later I heard them talking before dinner, in Dad's office. I wasn't trying to listen. I think you should know what I heard. I looked at Gwen. Call him, she said. Bryce answered on the second ring. He sounded young and unsure of himself in the way that 16-year-olds do when they've stumbled into something that belongs to the adult world. Grandma, are you safe? I'm at a friend's house, I said. I'm completely fine. What did you hear, sweetheart? A pause, the sound of him moving somewhere quieter. It was before you got there, he said. Dad and Uncle Paul were in the office. I was coming downstairs and the door was open. I heard Dad say something about. He said the plan only works if you agree to the move before spring. Another pause. I didn't know what that meant at the time. But then at dinner, when you weren't at the main table, I kind of. He stopped. It's all right, I said. You can tell me. I think they've been planning something, Bryce said quietly. With the house. I think they have been for a while. I looked across the table at Gwen. She was watching me carefully. Did you record any of it? I asked. A beat of silence. I was doing a voice memo for a school thing, he said slowly. On my phone, it was still running. My heart was very loud. Bryce, I said, can you send that to me? Yeah, he said. Grandma, he stopped again. What is it? I'm sorry, he said. I don't really understand all of it, but I'm sorry that it's happening. tears came without any warning. "You have nothing to be sorry for," I said. "You did the right thing. You have nothing to be sorry for at all." After the call, Gwen and I sat in her kitchen for another hour. She pulled out documents, copies of the trust agreement, a summary of the accounts, the name and number of a colleague who specialized in elder law and estate protection. She walked me through everything slowly, in plain language, the way a good lawyer does when she actually cares about the person across the table. What emerged from that conversation was something I hadn't expected to feel on Christmas Eve. Not anger, though anger was present. Not grief, though that was there too. Clarity. The kind that only comes when you stop trying to reframe an uncomfortable truth into something more tolerable. My children had been discussing my home as a transaction. They had been calculating timing and strategy, without once asking whether I was happy, whether I was lonely, whether I needed anything that had nothing to do with property values. And my husband, from somewhere on the other side of 11 weeks of terrible illness, had seen it coming and loved me enough to build walls I didn't even know existed. I drove to a hotel that night, a small place near the lake that I knew from years of taking out-of-town guests. Gwen offered her spare room and I declined, gently. I needed to be alone. I needed to think. The phone continued buzzing on the nightstand after I'd checked in. I turned it face down and did not look at it until morning. By then, there were 23 messages. I read Paul's first, "The way you examine the thing you're most afraid of." They started concerned and grew increasingly urgent with a quality I recognized. Not the urgency of someone worried about a person, but of someone worried about a situation. The phrasing kept snagging on me. "We need to sort this out. There are things we need to discuss. Please call us. This can't wait. Can't wait." That phrase told me everything I needed to know about what was actually driving the panic. The following morning, I called my bank. I asked for a complete account review. I asked who held authorization access, what secondary permissions existed, what could be accessed or monitored without my active involvement. The representative's answer was careful and professional, and underneath the professional language was the clear shape of things I hadn't known were in place. Paul had been added as an account observer 4 years ago, shortly after Walter died. I had no memory of approving this. It was possible I had signed something during the fog of early grief without understanding what I was signing. I had it removed. Then I called Gwen's colleague, a woman named Patricia Holden, who had a calm voice and a thorough understanding of everything relevant to my situation. We spoke for nearly an hour. By the end of the call, several things had been set in motion. An independent legal review of the estate, an update to certain authorizations, a documentation process that would ensure any future decisions about the house involved multiple independent parties and could not be rushed or pressured. Bryce's recording arrived that afternoon. I listened to it alone in the hotel room with the curtains open and the lake gray and flat outside. The audio was imperfect, the sound of a phone in a pocket, voices muffled by a closed door, but audible. Conrad's voice. Paul's. A phrase I recognized from the night before. Too much for one person. And then something new, something I hadn't heard from the hallway. Paul saying, in the flat tone of a man reviewing a business problem, "If she's resistant, we go through the GP route, get documentation." And the conversation becomes a lot easier to have, the GP route. Documentation. I knew what he meant. I think I had known, on some level, since Sylvia had mentioned a retirement community months ago in a way that seemed too rehearsed, too specific to be entirely spontaneous. They were considering having my competency questioned, not necessarily as a first move, but as a contingency, a backup, a door they'd identified in case I proved difficult. I forwarded the audio to Patricia Holden without comment. She called me back within the hour. Her voice was still calm, but something underneath it had sharpened. "This is serious," she said. "I know," I said. "It doesn't necessarily mean a crime has been committed, but it means we need to be very deliberate about what happens next." "I know that too," I said. "What happened next was this. I arranged a meeting, not a confrontation in a living room or a difficult Christmas dinner replay. A meeting in Patricia Holden's office, professional and neutral, attended by myself, Sylvia, Paul, Conrad, and Patricia. I gave them 5 days' notice. In those 5 days, I did 2 other things. I called Bryce and thanked him again. and we had the longest conversation we'd had in years. About school and hockey, and a girl he liked, and the graphic novel he was trying to write. It was the first time in a long while that someone in my family had talked to me, as though I was simply a person they wanted to talk to. And I drove to a small town 2 hours north of Oakville, a place Walter and I had visited years ago on a fall weekend, where there were pine trees and a clear river and a hardware store that still had the same sign it had in 1987. I walked along the river for an hour. I ate soup at a diner, where the woman behind the counter called me Hon, and meant it. I thought about what kind of life I wanted the next chapter of mine to look like. The meeting took place on a Thursday in January. Patricia Holden's office was quiet and professional. A table, water glasses, documents already arranged. I arrived first, as I had planned to. When Sylvia came through the door, she looked older than she had at Christmas. Worry does that. So does the feeling of being caught in something you can't quite explain away, she said. Mom. The way she said it had the shape of an apology without committing to one yet. Paul came in behind her. He didn't make eye contact immediately. Conrad sat at the far end of the table and looked at Patricia Holden with the particular expression of a person assessing their adversary. He had misread the room. Patricia was not adversarial, but she was thorough, and thorough was enough. She walked through the documents, the trust structure, the account protection, the recording, the phrase about the GP route. She was precise and unhurried, and she did not raise her voice once. The silence in the room grew with each page. I let it grow. It was Sylvia who broke first. She began crying quietly, the way people cry when they're not sure whether they're crying from guilt or from shame, or from the specific grief of watching something they'd hoped to avoid happening anyway. I want to understand something, I said finally, and the room went still. Not the legal part. Patricia has covered that. I want to understand. Was there any point in any of those conversations where you thought to simply ask me what I wanted? No one answered. I've been in that house for 40 years, I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. Your father built the back deck with his own hands. Your grandmother's tortilla recipe is folded in the second drawer in the kitchen. Last spring, I planted the same rose that's been in the front bed since 1989 because the original finally died and I wasn't ready to lose it. I looked at Sylvia. Did you know that? She shook her head. No, I said. Because you haven't asked. Not once in 4 years has either of you asked what my life looks like, what I do in the mornings, whether I'm well, whether I'm lonely. I paused. You've asked about the furnace and the estate accountant and whether I've had the car serviced. You've treated me like a property that required maintenance. Paul pressed his lips together. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. We were worried, he said. About what? Silence. Paul, I waited. Worried about what, exactly? About the house about it being too much. About you being alone. About what happens if I became inconvenient, I said. That landed. I watched it land. That's not. Sylvia started. I know you love me, I said. I'm not asking you to prove otherwise. But love that doesn't make room for the actual person is just management, and I have spent 4 years being managed. Conrad had not spoken. I turned to look at him directly for the first time that morning. He was a careful man, Conrad. Financially precise, professionally confident. Accustomed to controlling the frame of every conversation, he entered. But there was something in his expression right now that I hadn't seen before. Not guilt exactly. Conrad's self-justifications ran too deep for guilt this quickly, but an awareness that the ground had shifted underneath him. The house is mine, I said to him. It was mine before you married my daughter. It will remain mine until I decide otherwise. If you had questions about its future, the correct approach was to ask me, not to plan around me. He had nothing to say to that. Patricia placed the final document on the table, the estate trust confirmation, the updated authorizations, an outline of the legal protections now explicitly documented and fortified. Nothing here is punitive, she said. These are simply the structures that were always in place, made explicit and fully activated. Any future decision regarding Eleanor's property or finances will require Eleanor's direct, witnessed, legally reviewed consent. There are no workarounds. I watched my children look at the document. I thought about Walter, writing that letter with the pale blue notepaper. 7 months before he died, already making sure I would be all right without him. "I love you both," I said. And I meant it completely, even then, even there. But the relationship that exists going forward is going to look different from the one that existed before Christmas Eve. What was broken isn't going to be ignored back into place. If there is going to be something rebuilt, it starts with honesty, and it starts with respect. Not for what I own, for who I am. Sylvia wiped her face with the back of her hand. Paul was staring at the table. Conrad, to his credit, nodded once. It was a small thing, but I noted it. The meeting ended without drama. No shouting, no theatrical exits, just people leaving a room having heard things they couldn't unhear. I stayed behind to thank Patricia. She walked me to the door and said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done good work, "He was a smart man, your Walter." "He was," I said. "He also cried at nature documentaries." She smiled. "The best ones usually do." That was in January. By March, I had made a decision that surprised even me. I listed the house. Not because Paul and Conrad had pressured me into it. Because I had stood in every room of it on a February afternoon, alone, with the winter light coming through the windows, and asked myself honestly what I was holding on to. And the answer, slowly and without drama, had become, not the house. The memories lived in me, not in the walls. Walter's back deck would still be there for whoever bought the place. The rose in the front bed would come back in spring for someone else to see. The pencil marks on the doorframe would be painted over, and that was all right. They were inside me, those measurements. They had always been. I moved to a town called Eleanor, 2 hours northwest of Oakville, a place I had driven through once with Walter on the way to somewhere else, and had never quite stopped thinking about. A river runs through the center of it. There is a gorge where the water has cut down through limestone, for centuries, patient and unhurried. There is a bakery that opens at 7 and a used bookshop with a dog who sleeps in the poetry section. And a community choir that performs in the stone church every second Friday. I joined the choir. I am not a particularly gifted singer, which I disclosed up front, and which no one seemed to find disqualifying. I made friends. Not the complicated, history-layered friendships of a shared neighborhood, but new ones. A retired schoolteacher named June, who swears elegantly and grows heritage tomatoes. A widow named Ruth Ann, who lost her husband the year before Walter, and who understands, without explanation, what March is like. A man named Arthur, who leads the local nature walks and cries, apparently, at wildlife documentaries, which I have chosen to take as a sign from Walter that I was in the right place. Sylvia called in February. The conversation was short and careful, the first honest one we'd had in years. She apologized without conditions or qualifications, which is harder than it sounds, and which I received with as much grace as I could manage. Paul called in March. His apology took longer to reach me, and was less polished, but I could hear underneath it the effort of a person genuinely trying to see something he'd been avoiding. I don't know yet what those relationships will become. Trust is not a light switch. But they called, and they're still calling, and I'm still answering. Bryce came to visit in April. Took the bus up from Oakville by himself, ate half a loaf of my cranberry bread, and walked along the gorge with me for 2 hours, and told me about the graphic novel, and asked thoughtful questions about Walter. Questions no one in the family had asked in a long time. When he hugged me goodbye at the bus stop, he said, "I'm glad you went somewhere good, Grandma." I held him tighter than I probably should have. "So am I," said. "So am I. There is something I want to say to you, whoever you are watching this, wherever you are. Maybe you're in a kitchen in Halifax making coffee at 6 in the morning. Maybe you're in a retirement community in Victoria, where someone put a television in the common room, and you've found a moment alone. Maybe you're sitting in a house that's been yours for 40 years, and recently you've started to notice that the people who love you seem, sometimes, to be looking at the house when they talk to you, and not at your face. I want to tell you this. Your value is not the square footage of your home. Your life does not exist to be convenient for other people's plans. Being older does not make you an asset to be managed, a problem to be solved, or a resource to be timed and accessed and distributed. You are allowed to grieve what you hoped your family was. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to draw a line between the love you will always have for your children and the access you extend to your life and your future. Those two things can coexist. I know because I'm living in it. Walter used to say that the bravest thing a person could do was let themselves be loved by people who had actually chosen them, not people who had simply inherited them. I understand what he meant now, more than I ever did when he was alive to say it. If this story reached you today, I hope it reached the part of you that needed to hear it. And if you felt what Renee felt, what I felt, that specific kind of invisible that happens in a crowded room of people who are supposed to know your name, please leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're carrying. Because we are not alone in this, any of us, and some nights that's the most important thing to know.